Hey guys, welcome back. This is our World History WH6d lecture, The Enlightenment, or the Age of Reason. So we're talking about the scientific revolution. Remember we talked about the Renaissance and the Reformation, big changes happening in Europe. The Renaissance, remember, was a rebirth of classical learning and art, and it inspired curiosity in a lot of fields. We see the humanities, the study of history and sociology and psychology really start to pick up and take a perspective that is different, that human perspective. Remember, humanism is a big part of this, looking at man and his place in the universe, his place in society. And so scholars start to question ideas that had just been accepted as truth for a long, long time. The Reformation prompted people to challenge accepted ways of thinking about God and salvation. All right. The scientific revolution isn't a rejection of religion, but it is certainly an embrace of science to explain the natural world. And a lot of the folks that do this are very religious during the scientific revolution. They are very religious, and they go as far as to say, when you engage in science, when you study the natural world, what you're really doing is proving the existence of God, and these are deists, and their attitude becomes very popular, especially amongst the kind of educated elite. All right, so science will replace religion in explaining the physical world and explaining governments. All right, and the methods rely on experimentation and mathematics, especially things like astronomy and physics. All right, so reason is logical thinking, and the scientific revolution is going to spark a new way of thinking about the natural world. It's based on observation and a willingness to question your beliefs, even beliefs that have been accepted for a long, long time. We're going to call them into question and challenge them. Think of, there are things that we take for granted, but think of are we alone in the universe? Well, for a long time we might say, oh yeah, of course we're alone in the universe. Well, now people are really starting to question that, because we have these, tools that can look far out into the known universe, and guess what? There's a lot of rocky planets that are within the habitable zone of their star. So we're like, hey, you know what? There's probably other civilizations out there. They're just too far away for us to talk to. So for some people, that's pretty outlandish. Well, it was the same thing back then. People were like, what do you mean the sun is the center of our solar system? That's nuts. The Earth is the center of the universe, okay? So more and more people around this time are going to start to challenge just things that have been accepted as truth for hundreds of years. The scientific method is a logical method to observe nature, natural phenomenon, and we get it from Francis Bacon and René Descartes. So Francis Bacon believed in inductive reasoning. He says, we know what we know because we've experienced it. So he believed that if we can understand the world, we can generate practical knowledge that will improve people's lives. So he said you need to experiment to draw conclusions. Descartes said that you need to reject assumption, all right? Doubt everything. If you begin your experiment, if you begin your study with the outcome, the expectation in mind, you're already in trouble. He said, reject assumptions, all right? And just assume nothing and only believe what you can prove through logic, through experimentation. So he builds the scientific method using deductive reasoning. He famously says, I think, therefore I am. Descartes is considered one of the fathers of psychology, of the modern science of psychology. And he said, rely on math, rely on logic. Okay. All right. So for a long time, the geocentric theory was accepted as the gospel truth, which is that the Earth is the center of the universe. It's forwarded by Aristotle and Ptolemy. They said God put the Earth at the center of the universe. Remember the great chain of being? Right? God, the planets, the angels, all this stuff. This is great chain of being stuff. Well, guess what? That's going away. right? We're going to start to look at things a little bit differently, such as the heliocentric theory, or a sun-centered universe. The one issue with this, and this has been brought up before, was that they did not realize that the orbits were elliptical. And so the heliocentric theory had been around, but they thought, well, one, they thought that, the Earth was a perfect sphere, which it's not, and that the planets were even successively more perfect, and the closer you got to God, the more perfect things were. We know now that the orbits are elliptical, and that helps explain the way the planets orbit. But there's a growing understanding that the Earth and the planets orbited around the sun. Clergy and scholars rejected this because it contradicted their views. The idea that the Earth was the center of the universe was a major part of religious ideology at the time. So important scientists like Brahe and Kepler built on this model, the heliocentric model, and it takes men from the center of everything. It disrupts the great chain of being. It challenges those old ideas. These are derived from Copernicus, this heliocentric model. Like I said, he didn't understand the orbits, but he theorized, that the planets orbit the sun. They conflict with the Bible, or at least with that time's interpretation of the Bible. We have somehow in our modern times managed to reconcile the fact that the Earth's orbit, that the Earth and other planets in our solar system orbit the sun without seeing that as a contradiction to the Bible. Anyway, the idea that this heliocentric theory is in conflict with the Bible and accepted assumptions of the Catholic Church. So at the time it was a big problem, right? So the heliocentric model. Remember, these orbits are actually elliptical too, so our planets don't actually orbit in concentric circles. Although that was something that they thought happened, and so their math was off. They were having a hard time explaining why, things looked the way they did through a telescope, and then finally they said, well, the orbits are elliptical, and then it all made sense. So they proved Copernicus's ideas were true. Kepler proved Copernicus's ideas were true. Kepler says, hey, guess what? The orbits are elliptical. They're not circles. And that allowed him to mathematically prove that the planets revolve around the sun. Right? Elliptical orbit. You see, here we are. And his new laws were based on mathematical relationships, star charts, math. All right, he used a telescope to prove his theory. He built his own telescope and used it to observe the planets and their movement. And in doing so, discovers Jupiter and 4 moons, and he discovered dark spots on the sun. So his observations and laws of motion support Copernicus's heliocentric theory. Cool stuff. The theories frightened people, as new things often do. People were freaking out. They were like, hey, what do you mean? Why did it scare people? Because it went against everything they had been taught their whole lives. Right? And we can all relate to that. Sometimes this new earth-shattering information comes across, society changes, things change, and some people are just, they get scared. All right, change is hard. All right. Isaac Newton discovered laws of gravity. Look, the apple thing is sort of a myth, okay? I don't want to ruin it for you, but it's sort of a folk tale. But for sure, Isaac Newton is, one of the great fathers of modern science, and his laws of gravity are so important. The same force rules apply to motion of the planets and all matter on Earth and in space. Every object in the universe attracts another object. They all have gravity. Wow. William Harvey discovered the circulation of blood and the rule of the heart. Okay, so we're starting to, guys, there were some crazy theories when it came to medicine. Classical ideas, like they used to believe that inside the body there were humors, which are just like fluids, and so like you have like phlegm, blood, bile, right? And that all of our ailments basically were when one of these humors was out of balance. That's why you see, even well up into, you know, the time we're talking about, sometimes when people get sick, they bleed them. So they put leeches on them and try to bleed them. She's like, we got to bring your humors back into balance. You know, people still during this time period explained psychological disorders by saying that people were either witches or demon possessed. And there was actually a procedure called trephination where they would drill holes in people's heads to try to release demons from people's skulls. So crazy stuff. Now, during the Age of Reason, during the scientific revolution, we're starting to say, you know what? Let's apply science to our understanding of the human body and the things that ail it. Thank goodness, right? Thank goodness for modern medicine. Oh my gosh. Okay. All right. So the scientific revolution emphasized logic and reasoned observation. Scientists were systematic in their approach, taking measurements. Scientific method becomes the means of determining, outcomes, of testing ideas, rather. The expansion of knowledge created a new way for people to see the world. With its emphasis on reasoned observation and systematic measurement, the scientific revolution changed the way people viewed the world and their place in it. This is something that happens all the time. We make a discovery, we make a breakthrough, and it changes our worldview, it changes everything. And so this has been going on for a long time. All right, the Enlightenment, aka the Age of Reason. So people are applying reason to the human world and the natural world. This leads to things beyond just nature and science, because the same logic and reason is going to be applied to society. So religious tolerance is going to result from the Enlightenment. Democratic revolutions are going to result from the Enlightenment, as in America, as in France, as in Latin American countries that are ruled by Spain and Portugal. All right, why would science result in revolution? Why would science result in religious tolerance? Let's take a look. Enlighten me, right? Gain knowledge and wisdom. Be freed from prejudice, ignorance, or superstition. Think logically, use your brain. When people start to do this, then things like prejudice and ignorance start to give way to logical thinking, right? To understanding. So the Enlightenment takes place from 1600 to 1800, or remember the 17th and 19th centuries. What else is going on during this time period? Think about it. You don't have to write down 3 events, but think about some of the other stuff we talked about that's going on, right? The English Bill of Rights. In our next lecture, we're going to talk about the French Revolution. We see some things changing. All right. So 5 main Enlightenment thinkers we're going to look at. These men helped to lay the foundation for modern governments. They didn't realize it, but that's what they're going to do. As we go through each one, try to think about how they impact our government in the United States. And I tell you what, I'll help connect the dots for you, because you guys as sophomores have not had my VAUS class yet, so you might not know a lot about the influence these guys have in our modern governmental institutions. So I'll try to draw some connections for you as we go along. All right, Thomas Hobbes writes Leviathan. He's talking about government. Leviathan is a sea monster. Hobbes believes that humans exist in a primitive state of nature, okay, and that governments are basically a necessary evil to protect people's rights, to protect them. So people enter into an agreement. They give the government permission to govern, because if they don't, then that primitive state of nature will take over. All right. He's one of the original Enlightenment philosophers. He believed all humans are naturally selfish and wicked, and without government, there will always be war and chaos. There's a lot of truth to this. Government is not ideal, but it's sort of a necessary thing. Okay. How much or how little is where a lot of disagreement lies. But we know that governments have to be instituted among men to protect our rights. So in order to escape this horrible, chaotic life, Hobbes suggests that you need to give control to a strong ruler, one who would impose law and order. He believes that absolute monarchy as a government is best because they can impose order and demand obedience. Now, we've learned that that's really not the case, that absolutism is not a good way to govern. But what Hobbes is laying out here is something really important. He's sort of laying the framework for the idea that governments derive their power from the people. The people give the government permission to govern, but it's not absolute. We don't give our government license to do whatever it wants and impose order and demand obedience. We've come up with a better system. But Thomas Hobbes' ideas are important. Here's Thomas Hobbes. Here's, the Leviathan. I had to read it in college. I get the Spark Notes. Okay. All right. John Locke. So when it comes to American democracy, you're not going to find too many people more important than John Locke. Let's look at why. He wrote something which I also had to read, and I also recommend getting the abridged version, the Two Treatises of Government. He said people are sovereign. All right, that means people are independent. And they give their consent, they give their permission to government to rule them, but it's a social contract. It's an exchange. In exchange for that permission to govern, they expect that their life, liberty, and property be protected. Here's an example. I enter into a contract. I give the government permission to govern me. Therefore, I agree to follow the government's rules. So when I go out on the highway, the speed limit is 55 miles per hour. I'm going to drive the speed limit. If I don't, the government can penalize me. That is protecting the life, liberty, and property of other people. If I speed and am reckless, I can deny somebody else their natural rights of life, liberty, and property. Conversely, I expect the government to also protect my rights by making sure that other people can't speed or drive under the influence or, go the wrong way down the highway or something like that, So one of the original Enlightenment thinkers is John Locke. People can learn from experience and improve, he says. They have the natural ability to govern their own affairs and look after the welfare of society. All right. He criticized absolute monarchy because it ignores the fact that power comes from the people and that it's a two-way contract. He favors the idea of self-government. He says all people are born free and equal, and that the purpose of government is to protect your natural rights. Here's the kicker. If the government fails to protect your natural rights, you have the right to overthrow it. That's what's John Locke becomes really influential when, American colonists decide to throw off the rule of England. All right, but if you look at the Declaration of Independence, which, by the way, John Locke's words are right in it, it says, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. And the Declaration of Independence says that whenever governments become destructive to these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or abolish. So yeah, you can abolish the government, you can overthrow it like we told King George to take height, but you can alter it too. And that's why we have the Constitution set up the way that it is. So our Constitution is set up so that it can be altered continuously. It's what we call a living document. Our Constitution has been amended numerous times. Our Supreme Court has looked at our Constitution and interpreted it differently numerous times. Some examples. So when our nation was originally founded, only white male property owners could vote. Eventually, the right to vote was constitutionally extended through amendments to all males white and black. So I'm talking about the 15th Amendment extends voting rights to African American males, and then later on the 19th Amendment extends voting rights to women. All right. Now, did that perfectly establish voting rights for everybody? No. We had Jim Crow. We had disenfranchisement still, but the Constitution was altered to afford the franchise to other people in our society. So this is all the time being looked at and altered. Remember, power is derived from the permission of the people, the consent of the governed. It's John Locke. Montesquieu wrote The Spirit of the Laws. He said the best form of government includes separation of powers. Think about this for a second. Separation of powers. To prevent any one person or group of people from gaining too much power or having total control. Montesquieu calls for a system of checks and balances, for power to be a check on power. What does this remind you of? It is literally the basis of our government, right? Our government has a Supreme Court, okay, a judicial branch, and federal courts. It has a legislative branch, talking about Congress, and it has an executive branch, the White House. Here's an example, all right? Lawmakers can make laws, and executives can execute those laws. But the Supreme Court checks the power by judicial review. So it can look at things that the executive does or laws passed by the legislative branch and rule them unconstitutional, i.e. illegal. Unconstitutional means illegal. So, but the White House appoints Supreme Court justices, and the legislature confirms those appointments, right? And this is just one example, but these branches of government all have power over one another, and by doing that, they check each other and prevent any one group or individual from becoming all-powerful, which is super important. Okay, so Montesquieu. Jean-Jacques Rousseau wrote The Social Contract. I've talked a little bit about this already. He's looking at Hobbes and Locke, and he says that the government is a contract between rulers and the people. All right, remember my example. I enter into a contract with the government. I agree to follow the laws, and in exchange, I expect the government to protect my rights. Rousseau is committed to individual freedom. He disagreed with Enlightenment thinkers on many matters. Most believe that reason, science, and art would improve life. Rousseau believes civilization corrupted people's natural goodness. He said man is born free, but everywhere he's in chains. He said the only good government was one that was freely formed by the people and guided by the general will of society. He agreed with Locke on one thing. Government comes from consent of the governed. He said all people are equal, and status and nobility should be abolished. And he was his ideas inspired leaders of the French Revolution. A little bit of an issue with this, in that he said that people should submit themselves to the general will of society. All right, and he's a little vague on how we could do that, because let's say that the people, the general will of the people, is to outlaw redheads or Jewish people or Polish people. Should people submit themselves to that will? Can we have a majoritarian democracy and be free? And later on, we're going to see people like Hitler and Mussolini who agree, hey, people should submit themselves to the general will of society. And so that's not necessarily the right way to do things. Sometimes the general will is bad. We live in a pluralist democracy, where we protect the rights of minorities and don't allow the general will to make all the decisions. If we did, sooner or later, we'd all find ourselves in big trouble. So there's some issues with this. Okay, Voltaire believed in religious toleration should triumph over religious fanaticism. He believed in the separation of church and state. And he is a brilliant Enlightenment thinker. He fought for tolerance, He fought for religious freedom. He said, I do not agree with a word you say, but will defend to the death your right to say it. He also, one of his famous sayings was, crush the infamous thing. But he never really tells us what exactly the infamous thing is, so I'm not sure. He publishes about 70 books of political essays, philosophy, and drama. All right. So the Age of Reason in the 18th century, the 1700s, belief in laws of nature, applied to criticism of government and society and becomes the basis for human reason. We talked about Locke, Montesquieu, Voltaire, and Rousseau. Don't forget Hobbes. I'm actually going to write the whole thing. Yes, okay. Famous thinkers. Their ideas inspired revolutions. We're going to talk about the French Revolution here shortly. All right, the bloody French Revolution. The influence of the Enlightenment. Political philosophies fueled revolutions in the Americas and France and elsewhere. Thomas Jefferson's Declaration of Independence, which is just dripping with Enlightenment philosophy, especially John Locke. The Constitution of the United States of America, and our government are going to be based on these, and our Bill of Rights is going to be based on Enlightenment philosophy. So how are these thinkers different from scientists? They applied reasons to the human world, not the natural world. Government and law are what they're looking at, not just the natural world. Scientists applied reason to it using the scientific method. So, all right, we're not going to worry about filling this out. So Enlightenment thinkers believe that human progress was possible through the application of scientific knowledge and reason to issues of law and government. Enlightenment ideas influenced the leaders of the American Revolution and the writing of the Declaration of Independence. Thomas Jefferson really takes a long, hard look at John Locke, Hobbes, Rousseau when he writes the Declaration of Independence, especially Locke. We talked about the heliocentric theory. The sun is the center of the universe. Kepler said, guess what? The orbits are elliptical, so now the math makes sense and proves it. Okay? All right. In the arts and philosophy and literature, there are also major developments, and we'll take a look at those. So we've got Bach. He's a Baroque composer. All right? With Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart, who is a classical composer. With Don Quixote, a novelist. All right? Or, I'm sorry, Miguel de Cervantes, who wrote Don Quixote. It's kind of a comedy. This guy's, a bumbling kind of knight who has mistaken a windmill for a giant and is charging it on horseback. So it's kind of pokes fun at sort of traditional notions about knighthood and chivalry and all that stuff. It's definitely worth a read. You should check it out, Cervantes. We get Delacroix, who's a painter. This is Lady Liberty leading the people. Look familiar? I think Statue of Liberty, right? Look, this is the French Revolution. Right? It's a people's revolution. The French Revolution is very violent and bloody. We'll get into it in our next lecture. All right, so new schools of art and forms of literature. We see paintings that have classical subjects, all right, but we're seeing more public events, more natural scenes and more living people. That humanist influence is there, that Enlightenment influence is there. Like, look at this. This is definitely a humanist, very natural and realistic depiction of the world. It's not idyllic. It's not religious, right? It's human-centered, okay? And the people in this painting are very much alive. Well, I mean, these people, anyway, not to make light of the violence that's going on, but this is a very visceral scene that we're seeing. You know what I'm saying? Like, we're not looking at some natural painted landscape that's idyllic and make-believe. This is as real as it gets. Okay. New forms of literature, Cervantes, Don Quixote. It's a pretty cool book. technologies improve, roads, so macadamized roads that are all-weather roads that don't turn into just muddy, impassable sort of pits, right? So all-weather roads are going to allow for increased transport and trade. New design in farm tools increases productivity. We're going to see like seed drills and mechanical reapers and things like that follow along soon. We're going to see an agricultural revolution that is going to give way to an industrial revolution. Ship design is going to improve. It's going to lower the cost of transport and drive that process of trade that is part of that globalization process that I told you guys about. So the 16th, 17th, and 18th century brought a lot of changes in the arts, in literature, and in political philosophy. All right, the Age of Reason witnessed inventions and innovations in technology that stimulated trade and transportation. Okay, so some of the composers, artists, and philosophers of the period, remember we talked about those guys, I'll let you think about that. This concludes our SOL 6, a Scientific Revolution and Enlightenment lecture. Make sure you guys do the discussion board, fill out the guided notes, and of course answer those chapter questions. All right, see you next time.